Welcome back, everybody. Here we are, the last lesson, 9.10. Okay, that is officially the last lesson of the AP Environmental Science curriculum, but I am not teaching it at the end of the year. I know some of you are like, whoa, wow, we're awesome. We're already at the end. Not exactly. I kind of bring this one up because I think it actually fits very perfectly based off of the previous lesson talking about natural disruptions to the ecosystem. Well, let's start talking about human impacts on ecosystems, and then not only that, human impacts on biodiversity. I think it fits a little bit better in here. Yes, we are going to reference some things that we're going to talk about later on in the year, so I'm kind of going to be like, hey, we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this. But for the most part, it's a great lesson for us to kind of go over right now, and I think it's really going to be engaging. Here's the downside to it. It's going to be a longer lesson, so I'm sorry for that now, but I think I'll do my best to keep you guys engaged as best I can as we work our way through. So without further ado, let's get started. So what does the College Board say that you must know about this lesson? You should be able to explain, again, that big detailed descriptor. And then when you talk about all the different essential contents associated from explaining how human activities affect biodiversity and strategies to combat the problems, you can see that there's a lot of stuff here. A lot of standards, a lot of information. So I'm going to try my best to cover everything. At the end of this, if you read through these, you're like, you know what, I don't really get that. Maybe you can go over it again. Absolutely. I have no problem going over it. But also I might be like, hey, I know you don't get it right now, but in a month, I promise you we're going to go over that. Or in 2 months, I promise you we're going to go over that. So let's first start talking. If this whole lesson is about human impacts on biodiversity, let's talk about where did humans come from. When we talk about an evolutionary standpoint, humans evolved on this planet somewhere between, 5 to 1 million years ago, depending on where you're kind of getting your information from. And when we really look at the true human, the Homo sapien, they really haven't been on the planet too long, maybe only 250 to 300,000 years, but our prior organisms that evolved into us, the different hominid species. We refer to hominids referring to upright walking, bipedal, meaning 2 legs and 2 feet, a developed or much larger brain structure, a developed frontal cortex of the brain. So all of those things kind of factor in. And one of the most famous examples of that is the hominid fossil Lucy. It's 3.2 million years old. It's what we believe to be an upright walking hominid, not a true ape. All right, some sort of evolved species that eventually led to the evolution of humans. Now, the thing about human impact on biodiversity is we've been around as some sort of predatory organism. Now, when we look at humans, how are humans predatory? It's a great thing we kind of look at. If you start to take a look at the human being as an organism from an evolutionary lens. So what do we have that makes us or allowed us and our populations to develop to the point where they are at right now? What has allowed us to get there? Well, a couple things. One, we're societal organisms, so we live in clusters and packs. Not the most uncommon thing in the world. Things like wolves and a lot of other canid species, they live in packs. Lions live in packs. A lot of organisms live in family units or herds, different things like that. That's very similar to the way humans are acting. But from a predatory standpoint, how are humans predators? We don't have major claws. We're not incredibly fast and agile like a cheetah. We don't have vicious teeth. We don't camouflage in and blend in well and surprise and ambush attack. We don't have enough fur to really keep us insulated in colder environments. How did humans evolve to be the way we are? It's one characteristic which a lot of you probably don't really work on too much. Some of you maybe yes, but maybe not all of you. But it's the human endurance. Humans, as a predatory species, what they would do is, using again that societal approach, that pack mentality, would chase after animals. And humans evolved to be cardiovascularly fit, to fatigue another organism, to be exhaustion. And that's when the manipulation of tools, whether it be spears, rocks, whatever, other ways of other manipulatives we could use to attack said organism. So that was our predatory approach. It was that we would literally chase organisms until they were exhausted or cornered, and that would be a very successful hunting technique. It's actually practiced today by African wild dogs. And I know I get on this weird tangent about like a lot of the African predators. It's probably because I wrote a large research paper on the hunting efficiency of different predators. But African wild dogs are the most efficient predator in Africa from the major carnivore organisms. So you'd look at lions and cheetahs and leopards and other big predators. African wild dogs are the most successful. Like cheetahs might be only successful somewhere between 15 and 20% of the time. So if they go after an animal, only one out of every six, one out of every 5 times they actually catch that animal. African wild dogs are successful in 4 out of every 5 hunts. So they catch their prey 4 out of 5 times, which is incredibly high success rate. The reason being, they exhaust their prey. They chase them down until they can no longer run, or until they make a mistake and go somewhere, or they trip up and hurt themselves, and that's when they attack. But they're also in that pack mentality, so they don't have, they're an endurance organism. They're not the fastest organism in the world. They just work collaboratively. That's how humans work. Now, how did the human population get to a point where we're so impactful? Well, we eventually developed different things. And as society started to grow, and it wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution that we noticed our population starting to skyrocket. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, humans have had the greatest ecological impact on the planet. Prior to humans, yes, there were other organisms that used to dominate the planet as a group of organisms. But ever since probably the Industrial Revolution, or probably since 2,000 years ago or more, humans have been the dominant organism on the planet. Our current geological time is known as the Anthropocene, referring to anthropogenic, which is again the age of man. It's human influences. So what we're going to talk about is how everything relates to humans. I'd like you to pause this video. Again, we're going to do a little video inception here. Stop this video, watch this video. 3 minutes, 36 seconds, talks all of it. It's just a little comic, just a little video, kind of works its way through showing, what some of like the simplified impacts of humans are. This is a simple little distractor video. I don't want to call it truly a distractor video, but a little video I use just in class usually. But since you're not in class, hey, I'm asking you to watch it right now. So please pause this video right now. Watch this video. When you're done, come on back. Now, hopefully you're back. Hopefully you pause that, you watch that video, you're like, wow, that's cool. But it kind of just shows you the different impacts that humans have had and how they kind of just destroy the environment in different areas. When we talk about human impacts on biodiversity, we have a great acronym for it. And the acronym is HIPCO, HIPPCO. And if you can see here, what does HIPCO stand for? Habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, population, climate change, and overexploitation. All right, we're going to go through over the next couple slides all of these criteria and how it's actually impacting our biodiversity. So please bear with me as I go through what each of these are and how they actually end up destroying the biodiversity of an area. The biggest impact is through habitat destruction. So when we talk about habitat destruction, humans destroy habitats all the time. The reason why we do it, well, usually it's for some sort of profit or aesthetic purposes. Aesthetics being the way something looks. Like, for example, if you want to go to the beach, when we talked about biomes in the very beginning of the year, I talked about mangrove forests. Mangrove forests help to stabilize the beach. They help to protect it, lessen storm damage. So many beneficial things associated with mangroves. The one thing that people don't like about mangroves, they block their view of the waves crashing on the beach. So what people do is they come in and they cut down all these mangroves. That's just for aesthetic purposes. It's not for economic benefit. It's not like they're doing it because they need the wood from a mangrove tree. No, this is just doing it because they want to see the ocean, because they feel that's more important than anything. So what are some of the major ways in which we are threatening biodiversity through habitat destruction? Things like deforestation. Deforestation is incredibly detrimental. Destruction of habitats, then, and also it's something called habitat fragmentation, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. We destroy coral reefs, and the reason why we're destroying coral reefs is for shipping lanes. Coral reefs are very shallow. They're very rocky, so they actually can destroy ships, rip open the hull of a ship. So what they do is they use dynamite and literally blow them up and physically carve paths through coral reefs so that they can get places faster with large ships. If you've ever been on a large ship or any ship or any of your parents own a boat and stuff like that, you'll notice there's little buoys, different colored lights and stuff like that. It helps to identify channels along local waterways so they don't run aground on sandbars and various things like that. Well, think of that on a large scale with a large cargo ship or oil tanker, something to that effect. Mining destroys the earth, whether it be surface mining or subsurface mining, and actually both of them can have detrimental impacts. So that's very problematic. Urbanization, the idea of building more and more land for humans, for housing, roadways, all that is very, very detrimental to the environment. And then fragmentation, which I kind of mentioned already. So let's talk about the I in HIPCO. The I stands for invasive species. If you were in class this year or right now, we'd definitely be talking about a lot of different invasive species. We'd be going out to Idlewood. We'd probably be seeing different invasive species in action. So I want you to just kind of get an understanding. An invasive species, which is often referred to as alien or introduced, will be discussed in our next one of our next lessons. So this is 9.10. I'm going to do 9.9 and 9.8 in the next two subsequent lessons. One is on endangered species, one is on invasive species. So I know I'm kind of like kicking the can down the road here, but I will elaborate on this much, much more in the next couple lessons. But understanding that bringing an organism into an area will disrupt the food webs, disrupt the food chains, and it can lead to an ecosystem collapse, mainly due to the fact that these organisms don't have predators. That is one of the big things about invasive species, why they're so destructive, is there's nothing really controlling them. And right now, in our area, we're seeing a lot of invasive species do potential huge amounts of damage. All right, things like the spotted lanternfly over here. This spotted lanternfly, these are the 4 stages of the spotted lanternfly's life cycle. Maybe you're familiar with them. If you are, hopefully you're out there crushing them, killing them, just doing whatever you can. And I appreciate those efforts. But things like this little guy, this is an emerald ash borer. This is why we're not allowed out into all of Idlewood, because it's killed off ash trees. This little beetle gets into the bark and kind of just kills it off. Here you have one of the #1 threats to the Florida Everglades, the Burmese python. People get these small little snakes as pets, and Burmese pythons can live for 20 plus years, and they can grow in size roughly, a foot to a foot and a half in size per year if they're fed properly. So you get 12, 13, 18, 19 foot long snakes as pets. Yeah, people don't want them anymore, so they release them. And now they're just taking over the Florida Everglades, and they're breeding on their own, and they're just so much to eat for them. We talk about things like carp, Asiatic carp, which are leading to some of the destructions of local waterways, but they're originally introduced to help control algae in fisheries or fish farms, I should say. All right, next, the P in HIPCO. The P in HIPCO is human population. There's a second one for pollution. I'm going to get to that with the next slide. So the first P I'm going to address is population, and specifically human population. So how has human population changed over time? Well, we know that the human population ever since the Industrial Revolution has been growing exponentially. Good news, that growth rate is slowing. Bad news, it's going to continue to grow. If you think traffic is bad now, wait like 20 years when there's almost twice, or not twice, but there's going to be far more cars on the road, drastically far more cars on the road. So it's just something to be aware of. And remember, when we talk about a growing population, we're talking about just humans right now. All of those populations have needs. So every human has certain needs: food, water, and we as humans like to live within structures. We need structures to help support it. So how do we fix that? Well, our city's going to become full of more skyscrapers. We can't really build out anymore. So are we going to start to build up? Or are people going to start to live in smaller and smaller houses? So apartments and townhouses become the norm, which means our population densities are going to be increased. And as we're seeing with the coronavirus pandemic, how it spreads in really dense populous areas, is that going to be more problems in the long run? But it's these human needs, it's these human needs for structure, water, whatnot, that are pulling and stressing the ecosystem. Our pollution, which we're going to get to now as the second P, is stemming from all this excess human population. So it's something to be aware of. Now, I am definitely going to kick the can down the road when it comes to pollution. There are two massive units in our AP Environmental Science curriculum which deal with just pollution and effects of pollution. So we're going to wait till we get to there. Aquatic pollution or water pollution is going to occur in Unit 8, and then air pollution is going to occur in Unit 7. So I'm going to kind of kick them down. We'll talk about the other types of pollution when we get to those, the lesser pollutions, back in those, or later on in the year when we talk about those topics. So please don't fault me if I skipped over those topics. I promise you in a couple weeks to months, we will be going over those topics. The C in HIPCO is the elephant in the room. I know there's not really an elephant in this room. Maybe some of you are sitting around looking around your room going, I've got an elephant in my room, all right? Or like some sort of little stuffed animal. Okay. The elephant in the room, from a proverbial standpoint, is the problem that no one seems to want to address, and it's climate change. Climate change, and I know I've addressed this earlier, we're going to talk about it more later on in the year, but it is so problematic and nobody seems to want to address it, and we're just going to kind of pass it on to subsequent generations. And that's going to be at the point where there's nothing they're going to be able to do. It's important for us, especially when we talked about just in some of the previous lessons, all right? So back thinking about when we talked about ecological footprints, making the sustainable choices. When you make the sustainable choices, you are going to help the planet in the long run. This is a long game, all right? We are investing now in the future, and that's what we're talking about with climate change. We have already are dealing with the problems from previous generations, the boomer generation and the generations that came before them, the problems that were instilled upon the planet and societies. We are dealing with them head on right now. And we still have people that are refusing to address a lot of these things. There are a lot of things that we can do, and I think we are going to see them happen, especially in your lifetimes, which is very nice to see. It brings a little bit of hope. It brings a little bit of clarity to what we should be doing as a society. Things like addressing the burning of fossil fuels because it's linked to climate change. Things like addressing animal production for food, addressing deforestation, addressing the rising sea levels. We are doing that, and it's going to help us to support future generations. The O in HIPCO. The O in HIPCO stands for overexploitation. And this goes back to tragedy of the commons. Way back in the beginning of the year, we talked about tragedy of the commons, the idea that you have some sort of common or publicly owned entity, not privately owned, and that resource is then exploited. All right, it is overused, overexploited. There we go. That's how we get this word and why it's a part of HIPCO. The overexploitation of a resource leads to depletion of that resource. So tragedy of the commons, again, depleting the oceans, depleting the atmosphere of its beneficial state and looking to more problematic conditions. Things like overfishing, overharvesting, poaching, all of those are going and destroying ecosystems because we are harvesting organisms from those areas. All right, now, aside from HIPCO, let's go elaborate on some of these topics that we kind of talked about previously. The idea of habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation is when you fragment or break apart a habitat into smaller pieces. By breaking it apart into smaller pieces, now you don't have that same continuous habitat. And when we talk about certain organisms, like we talked about in the beginning of the year, the idea that they have a large range or territory in which they live in, that's one of those needs of an organism. If it is now disrupted, they're going to try to traverse that ecosystem. All right. So things like a roadway or railways or sidewalks, even, can be fragmenting the habitat. Think of like a sidewalk running through a marshland. Now you have to have organisms that normally are used to moving through water or very wet habitat coming up onto land, drying out on the sidewalk and getting across. And things like salamanders and other amphibians aren't going to be able to move that rapidly. So it's not like this is a very easy thing. Like a human, yeah, how hard is it for you to walk across a sidewalk? It's pretty easy. All right, even roadways, pretty easy. You can get across it in mere seconds. But things like worms or snails or turtles or salamanders, they don't move as fast. And now those habitats, those disruptions are very, very problematic to them. Fragmenting the habitat creates smaller, what we would refer to as habitat islands. And we talked about island biogeography from a conservation standpoint. Do we want to do this? Do we want to break it into smaller pieces? And then we talked about proximity, size of the parcel. There's so many other factors that go in. And the other thing, and when we talk about this, it creates something called edge habitat. By fragmenting the habitat, you are introducing a different habitat around the edge. And the edge is interesting in that it's protected as kind of forest and that it's allowed to grow, but it gets a lot more sunlight, which internal parts of forests don't get a ton of sunlight. So by having more edge habitat, you're actually creating areas for invasive species to grow. So edge habitat leads to invasive species. And again, we're going to address invasive species later on in the year. So here's a look again of what habitat fragmentation might look like. The idea of having, a roadway through a habitat. And now, do you fault the deer for running across that road? Some people will be like, this is ridiculous. And I'm sure you could find if you want to find a ridiculous, I'm not sure if it's a true prank or not, but somebody called like an Australian or British radio show and was complaining about the wildlife crossing signs. And why are they letting the deer cross there and not in other safer areas? And it's like, well, it's not like you really tell the deer where to cross the road. So it's something that people talk about, and the best way to prevent it is to install ways to allow them to cross the road safely. There are some organisms, though, that have been introduced to our area that we have kind of built our economy around. Things like the honeybee. The honeybee is incredibly important because we use it for pollination. If honeybees didn't exist, I'll tell you right now, a lot of people would be starving in the United States. Another one would be our cattle. People use milk and beef, different other byproducts of cattle, leather, all of those things. Well, they're all brought over, they're domesticated from an ancient species of cattle called the oryx, which existed over in Europe. And then we brought it over here, and we've eventually elaborated on and expanded on cattle you'll find all around the world. So how do we minimize our impact? Well, it's very easy for us to point fingers. It's very easy to say, oh, you're causing the problem. Yeah, don't do that. It's more, again, going back to finding solutions to these problems. Yes, we want to stop people from creating more problems, but I think people really know what the problems are. It's now financially where decisions are made. If you start to choose different organizations, when you spend your money on different organizations that are going to be more sustainable, now you're making choices to, kind of get away from those detrimental impacts. Things that we can do to help prevent biodiversity loss, we can protect wildlife habitats, so trying to keep them intact or protected from human disruptions. Things like habitat corridors, and I'm going to talk about habitat corridors in a little bit, but a pathway for them to migrate or go through their normal movements and experience their normal ranges without having to deal with roadways or finding ways that you could safely cross the roads. Sustainable land use, so instead of just blanketing it with pesticides and fertilizers, maybe we start to find ways that kind of work together. And then finally, what can we do to restore our damaged lands that we no longer use? Can we go through restorative planting? Can we go through chemical mitigation of different areas. What can we do as societies to start to make a difference? There are a lot of things, even just in the United States, and this is United States specific here, of ways in which we protect the environment. Now, there are a lot of different things other countries do. Other countries sometimes are very proactive at protecting the environment. For example, Costa Rica is the benchmark for what it should look like to protect and establish nature preserves and national parks. But there are other countries doing more and there's countries doing less. The United States is probably on the lesser end. Yes, we value our national parks. We value being able to get outside, but we don't spend the money to protect those lands and keep them in pristine shape. The National Park Service is one of the most underfunded governmental agencies of all the governmental agencies. So it's something that we want to try to address, and hopefully it starts with political figures that put an emphasis on protecting the environment, protecting the sustainability of our society. So how do we go about protecting it? Well, we have a couple different agencies and a couple different groups that do different things. Our National Park Service, which oversees our national parks, our national recreation areas, national historic areas, national seashores, and what else are known as wildlife areas or wilderness areas. Our Forest Service, which overlooks our national forests, our national grasslands and rangelands, and most of our national wild scenic rivers actually usually flow through national forests. The wild and scenic rivers can also be part of the National Park Service, depending on what it's flowing through at that moment. But most of them, like 70%, are covered by the U.S. Forest Service. And then you have the Fish and Wildlife Service, which helps with the National Wildlife Refuge, National Marine Protection, but they also do a lot of anti-poaching lawsuits. So if you ever try to smuggle different animals in from across the country, or you hear about people illegally trafficking different animals, it's because of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is catching them and stopping them. National Park Service, recognized by the arrowhead symbol. What do they do? Well, they have national parks, they have national recreation areas, national seashores. Let me go through a couple of them real quick. What is a national park? A national park, there are a couple of them, there's 62 of them. They protect nature and the cultural resources of the national parks, of these designated areas of natural beauty. Things like mining, logging, and hunting are banned in these parks. They really stress the preservation of the land, keeping it the way it is. Then there's national recreation areas, which are different from national parks. In a normal year, I'd tell you that we were going to go up to the Delaware Water Gap, or you could go and do this on your own time if you want. Go up to the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. It was established in the 1960s because it was supposed to be a big flooded dam as a water reservoir for flood control along the Delaware River, and also as a drinking water and recreation area for New York City. But that kind of grassroots campaign stopped it. But we would normally go up there as an overnight trip in the spring, but I don't think we're going to be able to get any permissions to do that this year. But they really manage the land in a different way than a national park. So instead of being preservation, it's more of a conservation. So they want to keep the land the way it is, but there's a lot of hunting that goes on there. There's forestry can occur there. Different croplands and farmlands are modified and protected there. So it's different things like that. National seashores, all along the coastlines, designed to protect a lot of our species that live there. Same type of management principles as some of the other ones. Wilderness areas, covered under the Wilderness Act, which actually prevents any modern disruptions to it. So you're not allowed to take any vehicles in there. And it's actually interesting. It's like in a lot of the national parks, especially the bigger national parks, will have a lot of wilderness area. Most of the wilderness area in the United States is up in Alaska. But things like Yosemite and Yellowstone, they have wilderness area. And when they go out, there's a major tree blocking a trail or something like that. They can't use a chainsaw. They actually have to use historic saws and things like that to cut it, because they're really trying to keep the noise pollution down. So they're not bringing in any modern devices that will lead to disruption of that habitat. So it's actually kind of cool to see, but at the same time, it's not as much as we probably should see. There are 62 national parks in the country. I was able to go on a road trip across the country a couple of years back, and we got to see 26 of them. Absolutely should be at the top of your bucket list to go see national parks. They are incredible and they're in the United States. They get incredibly busy during the summer months. Millions of people, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, are going to the national parks, flooding it, and their infrastructure is failing. Parking lots are full, so people are parking on all different parts. They're destroying the habitats there. Back to all this stuff about, again, human actions and what's happening because of the increased population. And again, with the pandemic, people are getting outside. That's their safety net. So they're getting outside to try to prevent future disruptions of things. The very first national park was Yellowstone National Park. It's incredibly beautiful. It is massive. It is very cool. I will be going back. I did not get to explore it too much when I was there because I was there again in the summer months and it was just so busy and so crowded. I did not enjoy it that much, but I could see the natural beauty in it and I definitely want to go back. Put on your bucket list going and seeing Old Faithful. It's I honestly was like, this is stupid. It's going to be some geyser that shoots off every 46 to 49 minutes, whatever the time is. I was like, how cool is this? Just I spent the entire day walking around the thermal pools and different stuff like that. I thought it was so cool. It was just so different than anything I've ever experienced before that I highly recommend you take some time and go and check it out. The big point of the national park system is to stress the preservation of that land, keeping things the way they are. And that is the whole point of the national parks is to protect it and keep the natural beauty there so that if your kids go or your kids' kids go, they will get to see similar views. Yes, obviously trees grow and trees will die off and different animals will live and die, populations will change and whatnot. But the ideas, the premise, the basis of it will still be there. It will be protected land for you to see and experience nature. It's not like a petting zoo by any means, but it's designed to preserve the natural history, the natural beauty of the area. So, where do we see our national parks? For the most part, out west. When you go out west, you go and see a lot of more natural beauty. It was very interesting when I first experienced going out west. I was in 2007. I climbed Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is a national park out near Seattle. Mount Rainier, it's a 14,410 feet. It's the highest peak in Washington State. I went with my dad, and I remember getting so excited to go out there. We get out there, and it's just everything's green. There's just so much just forest land and preserved land and everything like that. And then the big thing I remember is getting in the plane to come back. And, back when people flew planes and enjoyed those type of things. I remember getting in the plane and everyone was so excited to come back to Philadelphia or to come to Philadelphia because they wanted to see the history. They wanted to see the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. And I get it, but I guess maybe I'm just a little used to it. I was raised, I saw all those things. I don't really care. I'd rather not see the city. I'd rather see, huge expanses of mountains and forests and snow-covered peaks and all these different things. So it was really interesting to see the dichotomy of the ways in which people view different parts of the country. We have the metropolis from Boston to Washington. So many people living in here. There's not large preserves. But our closest national park is probably Great Smoky Mountain National Park down in Virginia. Or if you want to go all the way up, another one that's really, really cool is Acadia National Park up in Maine. You can go across the country, get towards like Isle Royale and some other things. We have lots of national historic markers all across the country, but the big national parks are out west. So you have Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, you have Glacier National Park, Olympic National Park, if you want to see a temperate rainforest, the Hoh Rainforest, and then down into California where you have Yosemite, Death Valley, Joshua Tree, among many, many others. And Utah as a singular state, if I had to tell anyone to go back on the road trip I went on, if you could only choose one state to go to, it would be Utah. So cool. The national parks there are just so incredibly beautiful. I would highly recommend you try to get out to Utah to see the Big Five. It's going to be Zion. It's going to be Bryce, Arches, Canyonlands, and Capitol Reef National Park. Those big five are amazing, and you can then get really close and get on your way to the Grand Canyon as well, which is another absolutely beautiful thing. I could go on for hours on end talking about the national parks, but I'm going to keep moving on because I've already been talking for 30 some minutes, and well, I got to keep finishing this lesson. The U.S. Forest Service, what do? Well, they manage national forests, which again are actually based more on conservation, not always on preservation. So they're actually forested. They actually treat it like a crop. They will cut down the trees, sell it off for timber, but helping to maintain and manage their forests in a proper way. They protect national grasslands, especially in the center part of the country, and again, the national wild and scenic rivers when they flow through those areas. So again, you can see the distribution of national forests. Pennsylvania doesn't have too much national forest just up in northwestern Pennsylvania. But as you work your way across the country, you see the western half of the country, especially once you get past Colorado, like the Rocky Mountains of Colorado and over, are just full of large expanses of national forest. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife System, or the service, what do? Well, they manage a lot of, again, they have the political stuff in that they're managing the poaching and transport of smuggling of materials in and out of the country. But they also have different land preservation within the country here. They have the National Wildlife Refuge, which was established in 1903, and it was actually designed and funded by a lot of hunters, like duck hunters, who wanted to have areas where the migratory waterfowl were protected so that their populations should stay healthy. One of the biggest things people always talk about is hunting and conservation. Hunting and conservation, do they go hand in hand? They do. Because hunters recognize that if you do not have populations to sustain, you can't hunt them. So you have to have habitats, you have to have ways for these populations to rebound in order for you to hunt them in the long run. They also have the National Marine Protected Areas, which are designed to protect our oceans and coastal habitats. And if we talked about like different wildlife refuges that are near us, the closest one is John Hines, which is just actually down near the Philadelphia airport at Tinicum, Pennsylvania. And then you also have Edwin B. Forsyth, which is over in Brigantine, just north of Atlantic City. They're perfect stopover wetland areas for migratory waterfowl during spring or fall migration. All right, I'm working my way through the end, so I'm going to keep going here. I mentioned earlier habitat corridors as a way to help to to minimize the impact of habitat fragmentation. A habitat corridor is an attempt to bridge fragmented habitats with a corridor or a pathway of protected environment. So things like bridges with forested bridges. I know it sounds kind of weird to see a forested bridge, but this is up in Canada. This is an example where organisms will be able to walk across this bridge instead of going across the roadways. So that in theory, they don't get struck by a vehicle. So things like this is a boreal forest. You can tell by all of the pine trees here, but moose or lynx or things like that can cross over here in a protected manner. Not the best thing in the world. The best thing in the world would not be having this road here. But from a societal standpoint, you have the road, and now you're just managing different things. It could also just be building a small little pathway to connect those habitats. Again, when we talk about protecting environments, the more land you can set aside for conservation, it's better. Man, we talked about islands, larger islands it can help more species to survive. So that's something to see. One of the largest habitat corridors on the planet is run through the company, or not the company, the nonprofit group Pantera. And Pantera is the genus for a lot of the great cats of the world, specifically the jaguar. The jaguar lives throughout the Amazon in South America, but they migrate and move all the way up into Mexico. So this organization, Pantera, what they have done is they're trying to buy up land or keep land set aside for conservation purposes to allow the natural migration of jaguars back and forth from Mexico all the way down through the Amazon. And the reason for it is it helps to strengthen the genetic diversity to have those organisms being able to breed and populations mixing. Remember, when you isolate these things, you can lead to very, very problematic conditions, especially when we talk about things like genetic drift and bottlenecking and all those sorts of things. You want to keep as diverse a gene pool as possible. Diversity is part, or genetic diversity is part of biodiversity. So it's something that, remember, we want to talk about. Other examples of habitat corridors, again, this is up in Canada at Banff National Park, the green belt in Europe, which allows organisms, it's like a little, almost like a riverway for migrating animals through Europe. Then you have things like crab bridges in Australia, because there's a massive migration of these red crabs from one area to the other. And so they've built these specialized bridges so they go up and over from their breeding grounds to to the water, and things like tunnel systems and all sorts of stuff like that. And you can watch some different videos of that. What can you do, maybe even around your house? All right. Well, planting native species is actually just a very simple thing you can do to help your landscape, to help sustain the natural environment. By planting natives, you're planting naturally found organisms. And those naturally found organisms are going to have a huge trickle down effect to the ecosystem and the biodiversity. So one of the things that people do is they want to plant different, what we call ornamental landscapes, because they like the way they look. Well, the thing is, you can get the same success with natives, but people are like, oh, the deer eat this and the deer eat that. Well, yeah, because you're living on the deer's habitat. But you can kind of manage, and as long as you manage properly, you can do well. So let's talk about why planting native plants is just a simple thing you can do to help the land use around your yard. Native plants are going to bring in native pollinators. Native pollinators bring in native predators, other insects that feed on them. And then those native predators establish native ecosystems and help to keep populations in check. So you are pretty much putting plants in your yard to help all the other organisms stay in healthy populations. So it's a very simple thing to do, but it's very beneficial in the long run. Almost done. I only got 2 more slides. What do we do to help restore damaged habitats? Well, how can we restore damaged habitats? Well, things like planting of trees. Trees are usually very, very hardy, especially native trees. They can tolerate a lot of changes. So they actually help to stabilize the soil, which will then allow more plants to grow, seeds to spread, and it will just help to reestablish that ecosystem. So simple things like tree plantings are ways in which you get involved, helping to make a difference. The removal of invasive species. Every single time you step on a spotted lanternfly, if you can catch it, awesome. You're helping to protect the rest of the ecosystem. But if you want to learn some more invasive species, so you can go out and maybe rip plants out of the ground, dispose of them properly so they don't spread, get them before they seed so they don't spread, all those sorts of things, or stop them in the first place. Those are all big things that you can do to help make a major difference. Removal of dams. Dams block off, oftentimes, most dams that we talk about removing are blocking small streams. They're blocking small streams, and there's really just as a measure of flood control. So by controlling the volume of water flow, you could actually then prevent flooding. Well, those dams, in doing that, stop a lot of the migration of small little fish and migratory fish, which some of which will spawn, especially things like salmon or shad. Shad on the East Coast, they migrate up the rivers. And so they come out from the oceans where they are born, and they're born in the freshwater, but they live their lives out in the oceans, but they come back to the freshwater to spawn and to reproduce, and then they'll actually die off for the most part. So anyone that fishes around here in the Delaware, you know that the shad run early in the spring. If you go out west, you hear about the salmon runs, but then you'll often see a lot of dead salmon all floating around, or dead shad in the Delaware River, because they've spawned and now they're dead. That's their life cycle. It's a natural process. It's not like humans are killing them because they live in our Delaware River and we're all polluting it. No, it's just the natural process. If you want to watch a video on your own, a little video of why they destroyed this dam, and then talking about the habitat restoration that they did for it, it's a great little video. It's 11.5 minutes long. Talks really about conservation and what people can do when they find time to get to it. So I'll pause and let you guys click on this link here. But this is the end of the slideshow. So let me go and start my little recap. Do you understand HIPCO, and each letter of the acronym, the H, the I, the P, the C, the O. Do you understand that? If you understand then the details associated with each one, do you understand how that has an impact on biodiversity? How invasive species impact biodiversity? How does habitat fragmentation, habitat destruction impact biodiversity? You're doing great. That means you know exactly what you need to know. Do you understand all the little lesser details, all the other things like the idea of habitat corridors, the idea of the national park systems and how they help to protect biodiversity if done right? And if you can understand the threats and you can understand the different conservation measures, you are in perfect shape. And I appreciate you that you've stood through or sat through the last 45 minutes or so of me lecturing about this. So I'm not going to take any more time from you. I appreciate you checking in. I know this was a long lesson, but I need to try to get it all done at one time. Hopefully you understand everything and you're in good shape. If you have any questions, you know what to do. Shoot me an email. But if not, I look forward to seeing you guys for the next lesson. We're going to talk about endangered species and invasive species. So get ready to check in on the next ones. Have a great one.
You like that lesson? I know you did. So why don't you go ahead and smash that like button right now. Go ahead and comment. Tell all your friends about how great that lesson was. And make sure you subscribe, because I'm going to keep bringing you AP environmental content that you're going to want to watch. Or do whatever else those other YouTube channels tell you to do. And with that, Maloney.